The Galactic Academy's xenobiology classroom buzzed with nervous energy. 23 students from 12 different species sat in their environmental pods, each one carefully adjusted to their home world's atmosphere and gravity. The air recyclers worked overtime, mixing oxygen for the Terrans, methane for the Zephyrians, and a dozen other gas combinations that would be lethal to most species present. Professor Keth Var, a tall, crystalline being from Silica Prime, tapped his teaching rod against the holographic display. His voice carried through the universal translators in crisp, measured tones that somehow managed to sound both educational and deeply concerned. Today, class, we will observe one of the galaxy's most dangerous predators in its natural hunting state, he announced. The Shadow Ripper of Vex 7. Please ensure your environmental barriers are at maximum strength. Even through the containment field, these creatures emit pheromones that can cause panic attacks in most civilized species. A collective shudder ran through the classroom. The Altarian student, Zix-9, pulled her tentacles tighter around her floating desk. Even through her water-filled breathing apparatus, her chromatophores flashed rapid orange patterns of distress. "Professor!" squeaked Pip-12, the small, fuzzy Corvinian in the front row. "Are you certain the containment field will hold? My grandfather once told stories about shadow rippers. They could tear through starship hulls with their claws." Professor Keth Var's crystalline structure hummed reassuringly. "The containment field is rated for Class A galactic threats, young Pip. You are perfectly safe. However, I must stress that no one should make any sudden movements or loud sounds. Shadow Rippers are attracted to fear responses, and despite the barriers, we don't want to agitate the specimen unnecessarily." The massive curved screen at the front of the classroom flickered to life, revealing the holding chamber 3 floors below. Even through the video feed, the creature was terrifying. The Shadow Ripper stood nearly 3 meters tall, its sleek black form rippling with corded muscle. 6 limbs ending in razor-sharp claws scraped against the reinforced walls, leaving deep gouges in the military-grade plating. Its elongated skull housed rows of crystalline teeth that could crush bone, and its 4 red eyes swept the chamber constantly, searching for prey. "By the 7 sons of Altair," whispered Zix-9, her tentacles now wrapped so tightly around her desk that they left suction marks on the metal. "Observe how the creature moves," Professor Keth Var continued, apparently immune to the waves of terror washing over his students. "Notice the perfect balance between its primary and secondary limb sets. The Shadow Ripper can accelerate from 0 to 80 kilometers per hour in less than 2 seconds. Its reaction time is measured in microseconds. There are fewer than 12,000 documented survivors of Shadow Ripper attacks in galactic history." The creature on screen suddenly froze, its head tilting as if it had heard something. Then it turned directly toward the camera, and every student in the classroom felt their blood turn to ice. Those 4 red eyes seemed to look right through the screen, right into their souls. "It can't see us, can it, Professor?" asked Therm Prime, the reptilian seeker whose scales had turned a sickly yellow color. "No, Therm Prime. The observation cameras are completely shielded. The creature is simply displaying its natural hunting instincts." Professor Keth Var paused his lecture as a chime sounded from his communication device. His crystalline form briefly flickered with confusion as he read the message. "It appears we have a late arrival joining our class today." The classroom door hissed open, and every head turned to look at the newcomer. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. It was a human. The Altarian student Zix-9 immediately jetted backward in her water tank, her chromatophores flashing bright red alarm patterns. Pip-12 dove under his desk with a terrified squeak. 3 of the mechanical collective units powered down their emotion processors entirely rather than deal with the fear response. The human appeared completely oblivious to the panic he had caused. He was young, probably barely past his species' maturity age, with brown hair that looked like he had just rolled out of bed, and clothes that were clean but clearly not formal academic wear. He carried a simple canvas bag over his shoulder and had what looked like bite marks on his left hand. "Sorry I'm late, Professor," the human said, his voice carrying an apologetic tone that somehow made him seem even more terrifying to the alien students. Humans, they all knew, were from Terra, a Class 12 death world where everything from the weather to the plant life actively tried to kill anything that moved. The fact that this creature could sound apologetic while being one of the galaxy's most dangerous predators was deeply unsettling. "Ah, Marcus Chen 7842, Professor Kethvar consulted his roster. "Yes, you're the exchange student from the Terran Colonial Education Program. Please take any available seat. We were just beginning our observation of a shadow ripper." Marcus looked around the classroom and seemed to notice for the first time that every other student had recoiled away from him. He shrugged and walked toward an empty desk in the middle of the room. As he passed, students practically threw themselves out of his way. The crystalline hive mind representatives actually reformed their collective structure to put more distance between themselves and the human. "Cool. A shadow ripper," Marcus said conversationally as he settled into his chair and looked up at the screen. "I've never seen one in person before. We had something similar back on Terra, but they were smaller. We called them shadow cats, but they were only about the size of your average hover car." The classroom fell into stunned silence. Only about the size of a hover car? The average hover car was barely 2 meters long. This meant that humans had creatures nearly as dangerous as shadow rippers just wandering around their planet casually, and they gave them cute names like shadow cats. Professor Kethvar's crystalline structure hummed with what his species used to express bewilderment. "You have creatures like this on Terra?" "Oh yeah, tons of them," Marcus replied cheerfully, apparently not noticing that his classmates looked like they were about to pass out. "Shadow cats, blood bears, razor hawks, glass spiders, sonic wolves. Terra's got loads of predators. My little sister actually had a pet glass spider when she was 12. Really sweet once you got to know her. The spider, I mean. My sister was a terror." The mechanical collective units were now running probability calculations so complex that steam was literally rising from their cooling vents. According to their databases, glass spiders were extinct Class 7 predators that had once terrorized an entire galactic arm before being hunted to extinction by 3 combined military fleets. But this human was talking about his 12-year-old sister keeping one as a pet. "I see," Professor Kethvar said, his voice carrying harmonics of deep confusion. "Well, perhaps we should continue with today's lesson. As I was explaining to the class, shadow rippers are perhaps the most dangerous solitary predators known to galactic science. They are completely untamable, show no capacity for learning or adaptation, and exist purely to hunt and kill. The specimen you see before you was captured at enormous cost and is kept in a state of constant sedation to prevent it from killing itself against the containment walls." On the screen, the Shadow Ripper had begun pacing again, its massive claws clicking against the floor plating. Even through the video feed, its presence seemed to fill the room with menace. Marcus studied the creature thoughtfully. "Has anyone ever tried to communicate with it?" The question was so unexpected that Professor Kethvar nearly dropped his teaching rod. "Communicate? Mr. Chen 7842, Shadow Rippers are essentially biological killing machines. They have shown no signs of intelligence beyond basic hunting instincts. Their brain structure is optimized entirely for tracking and eliminating prey." "That's kind of what people used to say about dire wolves back on Terra," Marcus replied. "And saber lions, and cave drakes. Turned out most of them were actually pretty smart once you figured out how to talk to them." The classroom was now so quiet that the only sound was the gentle hum of life support systems. Even the Shadow Ripper on screen seemed to have paused its pacing. "You're saying," Professor Kethvar said slowly, That your species has successfully communicated with creatures similar to Shadow Rippers? Well, yeah, Marcus said with a shrug. I mean, it took a while to figure out their language. Turned out cave drakes communicate mostly through scent markers and electromagnetic field fluctuations. Once we learned to interpret those, they were actually pretty chatty. There's one named Steve who works at the orbital shipping hub. Really likes Earth jazz music. Zix-9's chromatophores were now flashing so rapidly they looked like a broken light display. A creature that could tear through starship hulls was working at a shipping hub and enjoyed music. The implications were staggering. Perhaps, Professor Kethvar said carefully, you could share with the class some of these communication techniques? Marcus brightened considerably. Sure. It's all about body language and respect, really. Most predators aren't actually aggressive unless they feel threatened or are really hungry. The key is showing them that you're not prey, but you're also not a threat to their territory. He stood up, and every other student in the room immediately tensed. Could I maybe get a closer look at the Shadow Ripper? The camera feed is good, but you miss a lot of the subtle behavioral cues. The question hit Professor Kethvar like a meteor impact. Closer look? Mr. Chen 7842, the creature is contained 3 floors below us behind military-grade barriers specifically because it is too dangerous to observe directly. Oh, right, Marcus said, looking slightly disappointed. Safety protocols. We had those back on Terra too before we figured out how to properly introduce ourselves to the local wildlife. No worries, I can probably pick up enough from the video feed. He sat back down and pulled out what looked like a simple paper notebook and began sketching. As he drew, he muttered observations under his breath. See how it's favoring its left rear appendage? Probably an old injury. And the way it keeps looking toward the upper right corner of the chamber suggests it's either tracking something by scent or there's an air current coming from that direction that carries familiar smells. The alien students watched in fascination and horror as the human calmly analyzed one of the galaxy's most feared predators like he was studying a mildly interesting pet. His casual demeanor was more terrifying than any threat display could have been. The head-tilting pattern is interesting too, Marcus continued, completely absorbed in his observations. It's not random. There's a rhythm to it, almost like it's listening to something. Professor, are there any electromagnetic fields in that chamber? Radio frequencies, magnetic field generators, anything like that? Professor Kethvar consulted his control panel, his crystalline structure flickering with surprise. Yes, actually. The containment field generators operate on a rotating frequency spectrum to prevent adaptation. The current frequency is... Wait, how did you know that? The head tilting, Marcus explained patiently. It's following a pattern that matches what I'd expect from electromagnetic sensitivity. Lots of predators back home use magnetic fields for navigation and hunting. If your containment field is rotating frequencies, the Shadow Ripper is probably trying to figure out what's making all the electromagnetic noise. The human paused his sketching and looked up at the screen thoughtfully. You know, it might not be pacing because it's angry or aggressive. It might just be frustrated because it can't figure out where it is. Imagine if you woke up in a room where the walls were constantly singing at different pitches, but you couldn't see what was making the music. You'd probably pace around trying to locate the source too. This perspective had literally never occurred to anyone in galactic scientific history. Shadow Rippers had always been classified as mindlessly aggressive. The idea that one might be experiencing confusion or frustration suggested a level of cognitive complexity that no one had ever considered. That's an interesting theory, Professor Kethvar admitted. However, it remains purely speculative. We have no way to test such a hypothesis without putting researchers at enormous risk. Marcus looked up from his notebook with an expression that every human in the galaxy would have recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who had just gotten a really interesting idea and was about to do something that would probably give their parents gray hair. Actually, he said slowly, I might have some ideas about that. The rest of the class period passed in a blur of uncomfortable tension as Marcus continued his behavioral observations while the alien students tried to process what they were witnessing. A human, a member of a species so dangerous that most civilized worlds required special permits just to allow them to visit, was calmly studying one of the galaxy's apex predators and making casual observations about its emotional state. When the class bell finally chimed, indicating the end of the period, every non-human student practically fled from the room. Only Marcus remained, still sketching in his notebook and occasionally glancing up at the screen where the Shadow Ripper continued its enigmatic pacing. Professor Kethvar approached the human student carefully. Despite his crystalline nature making him immune to most forms of physical damage, something about Marcus Chen 7842 made him deeply nervous. "Mr. Chen 7842, he said, "I hope you found today's lesson educational." Marcus looked up with a smile that was probably meant to be friendly, but somehow managed to be deeply unsettling. "Oh yes, very much so. That Shadow Ripper is fascinating. I was wondering, would it be possible to arrange a more direct observation session? Maybe tomorrow?" The question was asked in such a casual, innocent tone that it took Professor Kethvar several seconds to process what the human had actually suggested. "Direct observation? Mr. Chen 7842, surely you understand that would be completely impossible. The creature is far too dangerous for any form of direct contact." "Oh, I wouldn't want to make direct contact," Marcus said quickly. "I just meant maybe getting into the same room on the other side of a transparent barrier or something. It's really hard to read body language properly through a video feed." The idea of putting a student, even a human student, in the same room as a Shadow Ripper was so far beyond the bounds of safety that Professor Kethvar's crystalline structure actually cracked slightly from the stress of contemplating it. "I'm afraid that would be absolutely out of the question," he said firmly. "Academy regulations strictly prohibit any direct exposure to Class A threats." Marcus nodded, though he looked disappointed. "Yeah, I figured. Oh well, maybe I can learn more about them from the library archives." As the human gathered his simple canvas bag and headed toward the door, Professor Kethvar called after him. "Mr. Chen 7842, may I ask what you plan to do with this information about Shadow Rippers?" Marcus paused at the doorway and turned back with that same unsettling smile. "Oh, probably nothing major. I was just thinking it might be nice to make a new friend." And with that completely terrifying statement, he walked out of the classroom, leaving Professor Kethvar alone with his thoughts and a growing certainty that tomorrow's class was going to be far more eventful than he was prepared to handle. The next morning brought chaos to the Galactic Academy's administrative offices. Professor Kethvar paced behind his desk, his crystalline structure flickering with agitation as he spoke into his communication device. "What do you mean he has a permit?" he demanded. "There is no permit that allows student access to Class A containment areas." Dean Flux Omega's voice crackled through the speaker, carrying what sounded like exhausted resignation. "Apparently there is. Buried in subsection 947C of the Terran Colonial Education Agreement is a clause allowing human students to observe dangerous fauna under supervised conditions. It was included as a cultural accommodation." Professor Kethvar's structure dimmed considerably. "Cultural accommodation?" The Terran representative explained that restricting human students from observing dangerous predators would be equivalent to preventing Altarian students from accessing water or keeping crystalline students away from mineral deposits. They claim it's a basic educational need. "A basic educational need," Professor Kethvar repeated weakly. The paperwork came through this morning. Marcus Chen 7842 has been granted permission for direct observation of the Shadow Ripper specimen, provided he's accompanied by at least one faculty member and 2 security officers. The dean paused. I'm sorry, Kethvar, but my hands are tied. The permit is legitimate. 30 minutes later, Professor Kethvar found himself in the Academy's most secure elevator, descending toward the containment levels with what had to be the most dangerous student in galactic history. Marcus Chen, 7842, stood beside him, looking like he was heading to a pleasant picnic rather than a potential death sentence. "This is really awesome of you, Professor," Marcus said cheerfully. "I stayed up all night reading about shadow rippers in the digital archives. Did you know they're actually quite social in their natural habitat? They hunt in family groups of 3 to 7 individuals." The two security officers, both heavily armed mechanical collective units, exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey deep concern despite their lack of organic facial features. "Mr. Chen, 7842, Professor Kethvar said carefully, "I want to be absolutely clear about the protocols. We will be observing through reinforced, transparent aluminum barriers. Under no circumstances are you to approach the containment field or attempt any form of interaction with the specimen." "Of course," Marcus replied agreeably. "I just want to get a better look at its electromagnetic sensitivity patterns." The elevator shuddered to a halt, and the doors opened to reveal a sterile white corridor lined with warning signs in 17 different languages. All of them essentially said the same thing: extreme danger, authorized personnel only, lethal force authorized. Marcus read a few of the signs with interest. Wow, they really don't want anyone down here, do they? The observation chamber was a marvel of defensive engineering. The viewing area was separated from the containment cell by 3 meters of transparent aluminum, backed by emergency force fields, backed by physical blast doors. The whole setup could theoretically withstand a direct hit from a military-grade plasma cannon. Through all these barriers, the Shadow Ripper was clearly visible. In person, it was even more impressive than the video feed had suggested. The creature moved with a deadly grace that spoke of millions of years of evolutionary perfection. Every line of its form was optimized for killing. "Beautiful," Marcus breathed, pressing up against the viewing barrier. The security officers immediately tensed, and Professor Kethvar felt his crystalline structure crack slightly from stress. "Mr. Chen, 7842, please step back from the barrier." "Sorry," Marcus said, though he didn't move. "It's just incredible. Look at the muscle definition in those limbs, and the way it carries itself suggests it's actually quite intelligent. See how it's not just pacing randomly? It's checking specific points around the chamber in a systematic pattern." As if responding to Marcus's observation, the Shadow Ripper suddenly stopped its circuit and turned toward the viewing window. Those 4 red eyes fixed directly on the human student, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "It sees you," one of the security officers stated unnecessarily. "Yeah," Marcus said softly. "Hey there, big guy." The Shadow Ripper tilted its head, much the same way it had done when viewing the video feed, but now the movement seemed more purposeful, more focused. "Mr. Chen, 7842, Professor Kethvar said urgently, "please do not attempt to communicate with the specimen." But Marcus was already pulling out his notebook, making quick sketches and notes. "The electromagnetic field rotation is bothering it," he said. "Watch its head movements. Every time the containment field cycles to a new frequency, it flinches slightly. And look at how it's positioning itself." Indeed, the Shadow Ripper was standing at an angle to the containment field generators, keeping its head turned away from the strongest emission points. "It's trying to minimize the electromagnetic interference," Marcus continued. "That's definitely intelligent behavior. Professor, would it be possible to stabilize the field rotation for a few minutes?" "Absolutely not," Professor Kethvar said firmly. "The rotation is a critical safety feature. It prevents the creature from adapting to the containment field. But if it's causing the Shadow Ripper distress, the creature's comfort is not our concern," the professor interrupted. "Its containment is." Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying the pacing predator with an expression of deep thoughtfulness. Then he did something that made everyone in the room freeze with terror. He knocked on the transparent aluminum barrier. The sound echoed through the containment chamber like a gunshot. The Shadow Ripper's head snapped toward the viewing window, and it let out a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a roar. Even through the heavy barriers, the noise was enough to make the security officers' threat detection systems go haywire. "Mr. Chen 7842, Professor Kethvar shouted. "Step away from the barrier immediately!" But Marcus was completely focused on the Shadow Ripper. "Look at its posture," he said calmly. "The threat display is directed at the electromagnetic field generators, not at us. It's not angry at us being here. It's angry at the pain the rotating fields are causing." He knocked again, 3 times in a steady rhythm. The Shadow Ripper's roar cut off abruptly. It tilted its head, listening. Marcus knocked again, the same 3-beat pattern. This time, the Shadow Ripper responded. 3 sharp clicks of its claws against the containment chamber floor. The observation room fell into stunned silence. "Did it just—" one of the security officers began. "Yes," Marcus said, his voice filled with wonder. "It's trying to communicate." He knocked 4 times. The Shadow Ripper clicked 4 times. 5 knocks, 5 clicks. "This is impossible," Professor Kethvar whispered. "Shadow Rippers are non-sapient predators. They don't engage in reciprocal communication. Maybe nobody ever tried to communicate with them in a way they could understand," Marcus suggested. He placed his palm flat against the transparent aluminum and held it there. The Shadow Ripper approached the barrier, moving with surprising gentleness. When it was close enough, it placed one massive claw against the barrier, directly opposite Marcus's palm. The 2 species regarded each other through 3 meters of protective barriers. The most dangerous predator known to galactic science, and a member of the most dangerous species to emerge from a death world, separated by the galaxy's most advanced containment technology. And somehow, it felt like a peaceful moment. "The electromagnetic rotation is still hurting it," Marcus said softly. "I can see it in the way it holds its head. Professor, please, just for a few minutes, could you stabilize the field?" Professor Kethvar looked at his student, at the Shadow Ripper, at the security officers who were clearly way out of their depth, and made a decision that went against every regulation in the Academy handbook. "Computer, stabilize containment field rotation for 5 minutes, he said. "Are you certain?" The computer responded. "This action goes against established safety protocols." "I am certain." The barely audible hum of the rotating electromagnetic field generators shifted to a steady tone. The change was subtle, but the Shadow Ripper's reaction was immediate. Its posture relaxed, the tension leaving its powerful frame. It let out a sound that was almost like a sigh of relief. Then it did something that no Shadow Ripper in recorded galactic history had ever done. It sat down. The massive predator settled onto its haunches like some enormous, deadly house pet, keeping one claw pressed against the barrier opposite Marcus's palm. Its 4 red eyes were still alert, still scanning the room, but the aggressive edge was gone. "Hello," Marcus said quietly. The Shadow Ripper made a soft sound, almost like a purr. "Mr. Chen 7842, Professor Kethvar said in a voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing?" "Making a friend, I think," Marcus replied. He slowly moved his hand along the barrier. The Shadow Ripper tracked the movement, moving its claw to stay opposite Marcus's palm. "This is unprecedented," one of the security officers stated. "A Shadow Ripper has never displayed non-aggressive behavior toward any galactic species." "Maybe because no galactic species ever tried to be non-aggressive toward them," Marcus suggested. He had pulled out a small device from his pocket, what looked like a simple audio recorder from Terra. "What is that?" Professor Kethvar asked nervously. "Just a voice recorder," Marcus said. "I want to document the vocalizations. If Shadow Rippers are actually intelligent, then those sounds it's making aren't just noise, they're language." He held the recorder up toward the barrier and made a soft clicking sound with his tongue. The Shadow Ripper's head tilted, and it responded with a series of clicks and soft growls. Marcus clicked back, trying to mimic the pattern. For the next several minutes, the observation room was filled with the most extraordinary conversation in galactic history. A human student and a Shadow Ripper, separated by military-grade barriers, engaged in what could only be described as an attempt at linguistic exchange. "Fascinating," Professor Kethvar murmured, his scientific instincts overriding his terror. "It appears to be learning your vocal patterns and attempting to adapt its own vocalizations accordingly." "And I'm trying to learn his," Marcus replied. "I think he's telling me about the electromagnetic fields. This sound here," he played back a section of the recording. "He makes it every time the field generators cycle. I think it means pain or discomfort." The Shadow Ripper had been listening to the playback, and when it heard its own voice, it made a different sound, a series of short, almost musical notes. "What do you think that means?" Professor Kethvar asked, finding himself drawn into the unprecedented conversation. "I'm not sure yet," Marcus admitted. "But I think he likes hearing his own voice played back. Maybe it means yes or correct or just, 'That's me.'" A chime sounded, indicating that the 5-minute stabilization period was ending. "Computer, extend containment field stabilization for an additional 10 minutes, Professor Kethvar said. "Professor?" one of the security officers questioned. "This is a unique scientific opportunity," the professor replied, his crystalline structure now flickering with excitement rather than fear. "We are witnessing first contact with a species we believe to be non-sapient. The implications are staggering." Marcus had moved on from simple vocalizations to more complex interactions. He was pointing at different objects in the observation room and making specific sounds, then waiting to see if the Shadow Ripper would respond. When he pointed at himself and said, "Marcus," the creature made a sound like a soft roar. When Marcus tried to repeat the creature's name for itself, the Shadow Ripper made those musical notes again. "I think his name is something like Vorth," Marcus said. "At least, that's the closest I can get to pronouncing it with a human vocal system." "Vorth," Professor Kethvar repeated experimentally. The Shadow Ripper's head turned toward him, and it made a questioning sound. "I don't think it can distinguish between our voices through the barriers," Marcus observed. "The sound dampening probably makes us all sound similar to his hearing." He turned back to the Shadow Ripper, to Vorth, and made a complex series of clicks and hums. Vorth responded with what sounded almost like laughter. "What did you say?" Professor Kethvar asked. "I tried to tell him that you're the teacher and I'm the student," Marcus replied. "I think he finds the concept amusing. His species might not have formal education structures." The rest of the observation period passed in a blur of unprecedented communication. By the time the session ended, Marcus had compiled nearly an hour of audio recordings and filled most of his notebook with behavioral observations. "Computer, resume normal containment field rotation," Professor Kethvar said reluctantly. As the electromagnetic fields began cycling again, Vorth's posture shifted back to the tense, uncomfortable stance they had observed before. He made a sound that was clearly distressed. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, pressing his palm against the barrier one last time. "But I'll come back if they let me. We can talk more." Vorth placed his claw against the barrier opposite Marcus's hand and made a soft sound that needed no translation. It was clearly goodbye. As they rode the elevator back to the main academy levels, Professor Kethvar tried to process what he had just witnessed. Everything they thought they knew about Shadow Rippers had been turned upside down in the span of an hour. "Mr. Chen 7842, he said finally. "What you accomplished today was remarkable, but I need to know. How did you know to try those specific communication techniques? Marcus shrugged, that same casual gesture that had been terrifying his classmates since he arrived. Same way you learn to talk to any predator, I guess. You treat them with respect, try to understand what they need, and don't assume they're stupid just because they're dangerous. The elevator doors opened to reveal the main corridor, where students were passing between classes. Several of them noticed Professor Kethvar and Marcus emerging from the restricted access elevator, and word spread quickly through the Academy's social networks. Within minutes, half the student body knew that the human exchange student had somehow convinced a professor to take him to see the Shadow Ripper. By the time they reached the xenobiology classroom, a crowd had gathered. "Is it true?" demanded Zix-9, her chromatophores flashing rapid patterns of disbelief. "Did you actually go down to the containment levels?" "Yeah," Marcus said, settling into his usual seat. "Vorth's really interesting once you get to know him." "Vorth!" squeaked Pip 12. "You named it?" "That's his name," Marcus corrected gently. "He told me himself." The classroom erupted in shocked chattering in a dozen different languages. The idea that a Shadow Ripper had a name, had told a human its name, was so far beyond their understanding that several students' universal translators actually crashed trying to process the conversation. Professor Kethvar called for order, but even he was struggling to regain his academic composure. "Class, please settle down. What we observed today has significant implications for xenobiological classification protocols. It appears that Shadow Rippers may possess higher cognitive functions than previously theorized." "Did it try to kill you?" asked Therm Prime, his scales still showing stress colors. "Of course not," Marcus replied. "Why would he want to hurt us?" "We weren't threatening him or competing for resources. Most predators only attack when they feel they have to." "But it's a Shadow Ripper," Zix-9 protested. "They're killing machines." "They're people," Marcus corrected firmly. "They just happen to be really good at hunting. There's a difference." The rest of the class period was unlike anything in the Academy's history. Instead of a lecture on predator behavior, it became an impromptu first-contact debriefing session. Marcus shared his observations about Shadow Ripper communication patterns, social structures, and cognitive abilities, while his classmates struggled to adapt their worldview to include the possibility that one of the galaxy's most feared predators was actually an intelligent species. "The real question," Professor Kethvar said as the class period wound down, "is what we do with this information. If Shadow Rippers are indeed sapient beings, then our current containment and study protocols are ethically problematic." "We should free him," Marcus said immediately. "Vorth doesn't belong in a cage." "It's not that simple," the professor replied. "Even if the creature, if Vorth is intelligent, he's still extremely dangerous. We can't simply release him into Academy grounds." "Then maybe we should find a way to send him home," Marcus suggested, "to Vex 7, where he belongs." As the class bell chimed and students began filing out, Professor Kethvar noticed that they were looking at Marcus with a new expression. It wasn't fear anymore. Well, not just fear. It was something approaching awe. The human student had done something that galactic science had declared impossible. He had made peaceful contact with a Shadow Ripper. He had learned its name. He had treated one of the galaxy's most feared predators as an individual worthy of respect and communication. And somehow, that was even more terrifying than anything they had imagined before. The news spread through the Galactic Academy like wildfire, then jumped to the broader academic networks, and finally exploded across interstellar communication channels. Within 72 hours, every major scientific institution in the galaxy had heard the same impossible story. A human exchange student had successfully communicated with a Shadow Ripper. Marcus Chen, 7842, found himself at the center of a media storm that he was completely unprepared for. His simple dormitory room was now surrounded by reporters from 47 different news networks, all demanding interviews. His personal communication device had crashed from the volume of incoming messages, and 3 different xenobiology journals had offered him substantial sums for exclusive publishing rights to his observations. He ignored all of it. Instead, he spent his time in the Academy's library, researching everything he could find about Vex 7 and Shadow Ripper ecology. Professor Kethvar found him there on the 3rd day after the incident, surrounded by towering stacks of digital data tablets and looking increasingly frustrated. "Mr. Chen 7842, the professor said, his crystalline structure still flickering with barely contained excitement. "I've been looking for you. The Galactic Science Council has requested a full presentation of your findings." Marcus looked up from a particularly dense ecological survey report. "That's nice, Professor, but I'm kind of busy right now." "Busy?" Professor Kethvar was taken aback. Students didn't usually describe requests from the Galactic Science Council as secondary priorities. "This is an enormous opportunity for you. The Council has never requested a presentation from an undergraduate student." "I'm sure it is," Marcus replied distractedly, making notes on his tablet. "But Vorth is still stuck down there in that containment chamber, and I'm trying to figure out how to get him home." This was not the response Professor Kethvar had expected. "Mr. Chen 7842, you must understand that the specimen cannot simply be released. Even if Vorth is intelligent, there are protocols, regulations, safety concerns. His name is Vorth, and he doesn't belong in a cage," Marcus said firmly. "Look at this." He turned his tablet around to show a complex ecological map. Shadow Ripper social structures are based on family hunting groups called pods. Each pod controls a territory of roughly 200 square kilometers on Vex 7. Vorth has been separated from his pod for 14 months. By now, they probably think he's dead. The simple matter-of-fact way Marcus stated this hit Professor Kethvar like a physical blow. Somewhere on a distant world, Vorth's family was mourning him. "That's unfortunate," the professor said quietly. "But the bureaucratic process for releasing a Class A specimen could take years. Even with evidence of intelligence, the safety review boards will require extensive testing." "Then we need to make this impossible to ignore," Marcus said, closing the tablet and standing up. "Professor, I need to ask you for another favor." 20 minutes later, they were back in the containment observation chamber. This time, they weren't alone. Professor Kethvar had invited 3 of his xenobiology colleagues, 2 representatives from the Academy's administration, and a xenopsychologist who specialized in first contact protocols. Vorth was pacing again, his posture tense from the rotating electromagnetic fields. But when he saw Marcus approaching the viewing barrier, he immediately moved closer, making those soft musical notes that Marcus had identified as a greeting. "Hello, Vorth," Marcus said, placing his palm against the transparent aluminum. Vorth mirrored the gesture with his massive claw. The assembled academics watched in stunned silence as the Shadow Ripper, a creature they had spent their careers studying as a mindless predator, engaged in what was clearly a reunion with a friend. "Computer, stabilize electromagnetic field rotation," Marcus said. "I'm sorry," the computer replied, "but you do not have authorization for that command." "Computer, stabilize electromagnetic field rotation," Professor Kethvar repeated. "Authorization, Kethvar Alpha 7. As the painful field cycling stopped, Vorth's relief was obvious to everyone present. He settled into a relaxed sitting position and began making a complex series of clicks and musical tones. "He's asking why I stayed away so long," Marcus translated. "I'm trying to explain about the other people who needed to meet him." Dr. Senth Kai, a renowned xenopsychologist, leaned forward with intense interest. "You can actually understand its communications?" "His communications," Marcus corrected gently. "And yes, mostly. We've only had a few hours to work on it, but Shadow Rippers, Vorth's people, seem to have a relatively straightforward linguistic structure. Basic concepts, emotional states, simple questions. It's not hugely different from early-stage communication with Terran dolphins. Terran dolphins? Dr. Senthke's translator struggled with the concept. You communicate with your planet's marine life? Oh, sure, Marcus said casually, still focused on his conversation with Vorth. Dolphins, whales, most of the higher-order cephalopods. My cousin Sarah speaks fluent humpback whale. She works for the Pacific Ecological Council. The assembled academics exchanged glances that conveyed a mixture of awe and terror. Humans didn't just live on a death world, they had apparently domesticated their death world. Marcus was making a series of complex gestures while producing clicking sounds. Vorth responded with what sounded almost like laughter, then began making his own elaborate gesture combinations. "What is he telling you?" Dr. Senthkai asked. "He's describing his hunting pod," Marcus replied. 3 adults and 2 juveniles. His pod sister Keth Vor is the primary tracker, and his pod brother Gennal is... I think the closest translation would be territory keeper. Vorth himself seems to be what we might call a scout or advance hunter. Marcus paused in his translation, his expression growing serious. He's asking if I know how to get home. The weight of that simple question settled over the observation chamber like a physical presence. Here was an intelligent being, taken from his family and held prisoner for over a year, asking if the first friend he'd made in captivity could help him return to the people who loved him. "Tell him," Dr. Senthke said quietly. "Tell him we're going to try." For the next 2 hours, the assembled academics witnessed the most extraordinary xenological interview in galactic history. Through Marcus's translation, Vorth described Shadow Ripper society, their hunting practices, their family structures, their territorial boundaries, and their complex relationship with Vex 7's other intelligent species. Because, as it turned out, there were other intelligent species on Vex 7. "The soft builders and the sky dancers," Marcus translated, his own excitement growing with each revelation. "Vorth's people have trade relationships with them. The Shadow Rippers hunt, the soft builders grow food, and the sky dancers provide transportation between territories." "This is impossible," whispered Dr. Chen Shu, the Academy's leading expert on galactic civilizations. "Vex 7 was surveyed extensively. We found no signs of technological civilization." Marcus relayed the question to Vorth, who responded with what seemed to be gentle amusement. "He says that's because they don't build the kind of technology we were looking for," Marcus explained. "The soft builders work with living materials. They grow their structures rather than constructing them. And the sky dancers don't use mechanical flight. They've bred specialized flying creatures for transportation." The implications were staggering. An entire multi-species civilization had been overlooked because their technology was biological rather than mechanical. Thousands of Shadow Rippers had been classified as dangerous animals when they were actually people with families, names, and complex social relationships. "We have to contact the Galactic Science Council immediately," Dr. Senthke said. "This changes everything." "First," Marcus said firmly, "we get Vorth home to his family." The bureaucratic machinery of the galaxy moved slowly under normal circumstances, but the revelation that Shadow Rippers were members of an advanced multi-species civilization lit a fire under every relevant authority. Within a week, a joint expedition was being planned to return Vorth to Vex 7 and establish formal first contact with the 3 intelligent species that called the planet home. Marcus, despite being an undergraduate student with no formal diplomatic training, found himself appointed as the expedition's primary xenolinguist. When he pointed out his complete lack of qualifications for such a position, the expedition leader, a seasoned diplomat named Ambassador Tern-Koss, simply said, "You're the only person in the galaxy who can speak to them. That makes you the most qualified person available." The night before their departure, Marcus sat in his dormitory room, packing his simple canvas bag. A knock on his door revealed his xenobiology classmates, led by a nervous-looking Zix-9. "Marcus," she said, her chromatophores flashing tentative patterns. "We wanted to apologize." "For what?" Marcus asked, genuinely puzzled. "For being afraid of you," Pip 12 squeaked from behind Zix-9. "For treating you like you were dangerous." Marcus smiled that same friendly smile that had terrified them when they first met. "I am dangerous," he said matter-of-factly. "All humans are. We evolved on a world that tried to kill us every day for millions of years. But being dangerous doesn't mean being malicious." Therm Prime stepped forward, his scales showing colors of deep respect. "You taught us that being dangerous and being good aren't opposites. And that maybe the things we're afraid of aren't always the things we should be afraid of," added one of the mechanical collective units. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Back on Terra, we have a saying. The most dangerous predator is the one you don't bother to understand. Works both ways, I guess." The next morning, the expedition ship Peaceful Approach departed from the Academy's orbital platform, carrying the most unlikely diplomatic team in galactic history. A crystalline xenobiology professor, a human undergraduate student, a professional shadow ripper, and a full crew of scientific specialists, all heading toward a world that the galaxy thought it understood, but clearly didn't. The journey to Vex 7 took 6 days. Marcus spent most of the time with Vorth, who had been moved to a more comfortable containment area aboard the ship. The electromagnetic field generators had been replaced with a simple energy barrier that caused no discomfort. And Vorth had been provided with a selection of foods from his home world. "He's nervous," Marcus reported to the expedition team on their final day of travel. "Excited but nervous. He's been away from his pod for so long that he's worried they might not recognize him." "Do Shadow Rippers have recognition difficulties after extended separations?" Dr. Senthkai asked. Marcus consulted with Vorth, then shook his head. "Not recognition problems exactly, but pod dynamics are complex. Vorth is worried that his position in the hunting group might have been filled by someone else. He might not have a place anymore." Ambassador Turnkos, a graceful being whose species specialized in interstellar diplomacy, nodded understandingly. "Family reunions can be complicated. Even under the best circumstances, the Peaceful Approach dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Vex 7 system, and every sensor on the ship immediately began detecting energy signatures that hadn't been there during the original survey missions. "Those are communication signals," the ship's technical officer reported. "Highly sophisticated, but using biological transmission methods we've never encountered before." Marcus was already down in the containment area with Vorth, who had become extremely agitated as soon as they arrived in his home system. "He can hear them," Marcus reported over the communication system. "The signals, I mean. He says his people are trying to understand what we are. Can you ask him to introduce us?" Ambassador Turnkos requested. What followed was the most unusual first contact in galactic history. Through Marcus's translation, Vorth explained to his people that he was returning home in the company of beings from other worlds, beings who had realized that Shadow Rippers were people, not animals, and wanted to make amends for the mistake. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The ship's sensors detected dozens of flying creatures approaching from the planet's surface, each one carrying a Shadow Ripper rider. But these weren't attacks. They were escorts. "They're welcoming us," Marcus said, his voice filled with wonder. "Vorth's entire pod is coming up to meet us, along with representatives from the other species. They want to escort us to the surface personally." The landing was unlike anything in diplomatic history. As the Peaceful Approach settled onto a clearing that seemed to have been specially prepared for their arrival, hundreds of beings from 3 different species gathered to witness Vorth's return. The Shadow Rippers moved with the deadly grace Marcus had first observed, but now it was clear that their predatory skills were just one aspect of a complex culture. They wore decorative elements that seemed to be grown rather than crafted, and their movement patterns spoke of sophisticated social protocols. The soft builders were radially symmetrical beings whose bodies seemed to be part plant and part animal. They had shaped the landing area by growing specialized structures that provided perfect acoustics for the welcoming ceremony. And the sky dancers were the most remarkable of all, graceful aerial beings who rode creatures that looked like living sails, dancing through the air in patterns that were clearly both artistic expression and complex communication. When the ship's cargo bay opened and Vorth emerged, the reaction was immediate and emotional. 3 adult Shadow Rippers rushed forward, and the reunion that followed needed no translation. The sounds of joy and relief were universal. Kethvor, Gennal, and Sithmare, Marcus identified. His pod sister, pod brother, and pod parent. They've been mourning him for months. The formal ceremonies that followed were conducted in a mixture of the 3 species' languages, with Marcus providing translation services that Ambassador Turnkos later described as miraculous under the circumstances. By the end of their first day on Vex 7, the Galactic Expedition had established preliminary diplomatic relationships with all 3 intelligent species, arranged for cultural and scientific exchange programs, and laid the groundwork for a complete revision of galactic survey protocols. But for Marcus, the most important moment came that evening, as the expedition team sat around a bioluminescent gathering area grown by the soft builders. Vorth approached him, no longer the caged predator from the Academy's containment chamber, but a free person in his own environment, surrounded by his family. The Shadow Ripper made a series of soft musical sounds. "He says thank you," Marcus translated. "Not just for helping him get home, but for seeing him as a person when everyone else saw a monster." Ambassador Turnkos nodded solemnly. "Please tell Vorth that we have learned much from this experience. The galaxy will not make this mistake again." Marcus conveyed the message, then listened to Vorth's response. "What did he say?" Professor Kethvar asked. Marcus smiled. "He said that mistakes are how people learn, and that he's looking forward to teaching the galaxy about his people, the same way I taught him about mine." As the alien suns of Vex 7 set over the gathering, casting strange and beautiful shadows across the assembled beings, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that first day in xenobiology class. He had come to the Galactic Academy expecting to learn about alien life. Instead, he had taught the galaxy that the most dangerous predators could also be the most loyal friends, that intelligence came in forms no one expected, and that sometimes the scariest thing about humans wasn't their capacity for violence, but their capacity for seeing people where others saw only monsters. Back at the Galactic Academy, his former classmates watched the news reports with a mixture of pride and amazement. Their human classmate, the one who had terrified them just weeks ago, had become the galaxy's most unlikely diplomat. "I still can't believe he made friends with a Shadow Ripper," Pip 12 commented to Zix 9 as they watched Marcus on the broadcast, sitting casually beside Vorth as they participated in some kind of interspecies cultural exchange. "I can," Zix 9 replied, her chromatophores showing patterns of deep respect. "That's just who Marcus is. He sees friends where the rest of us see threats." "Do you think," Pip 12 asked quietly, "that maybe that's why humans are so dangerous? Not because they're violent, but because they're not afraid to make friends with things that could kill them?" Zix 9 considered this for a long moment, watching as Marcus attempted to participate in what looked like a Shadow Ripper hunting ritual, clearly having the time of his life despite being surrounded by creatures that could tear him apart without effort. "Maybe," she said finally. "The reason humans are so dangerous is because they make the dangerous things not want to hurt them." On the screen, Marcus was laughing as Vorth tried to teach him some complex hunting maneuver, while sky dancers performed aerial acrobatics overhead and soft builders provided musical accompaniment. It was a scene of interspecies friendship that would have been impossible to imagine just weeks ago. And somewhere in the back of every watching alien mind was the same thought. If a human could make friends with a shadow ripper, what other impossible things might they be capable of? The universe, it seemed, was about to find out.